Closed captioning is brought to you by Insect Defend Patch. Deep-free protection from biting insects.
You know, when I look at these lures, they look so simple. I'm going to hold one up so you can see it really well. This is a tube, the actual plastic grub, and inside is a jig head, much like the one that I'm holding up here in my right hand. If you think about it, it's a really simple lure. It doesn't really have an action tail. It's just a tube of plastic where they've cut the ends off, and it looks a little bit like a squid. For some reason, this is probably the #1 grub and jig combination to use for smallmouth bass when you're fishing for them near the bottom. I'd say virtually in any lake in North America, especially in deep water. I think one of the reasons these work so well is that they're designed to be fished along the bottom where smallmouth do a majority of their feeding, especially on crayfish, leeches, baitfish. Sometimes they'll suspend up, but a lot of times they're around boulders and shoals and rock piles. The second thing is when they grab this thing in their mouth, the jig head is covered, so they're very soft and supple. And smallmouth tend to try to eat it. So if you don't set the hook in about 5 seconds, that fish is going to be hooked really deep. So they work extremely well. You can cover a lot of water with them. Now you can see the way I've rigged these. The jig heads are butted right up tight to the front of the tube. That's very important. So I wet the tube with a little bit of saliva, take the jig head, and then I insert it in as far as it'll go, and then I let the eye of the jig pierce through the top. Now the type of jig that you use is very important. If you're fishing in shallower water, less than 10 feet deep, you should be using a 1/8 ounce jig head or lighter, even 1/16 if you have calm conditions, clear water, spooky fish, and you need to use light line. The deeper you go, the heavier jig head you have to use, or if the wind starts to pick up, because the key is to keep this type of a grub close to the bottom. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the different styles of tube jigs. This one that I'm holding up is a traditional tube jig head. When I say traditional, you can see that the eye is sticking out 90 degrees to the shaft of the hook. And this is fine, and it works well in open water, or if you're vertical jigging it right underneath the boat. But if you're dragging this type of a jig head with a tube over a lot of rocks and debris on the bottom, it's most likely to get hung up because the front of it will get jammed under a rock. That's when I like to use a jig head that has a 60 degree. Okay, so you see here that one is 90 degrees, the eyelet goes straight up. This one in the front, the eye actually is 60 degrees. And I have another one here that's the same. So when you use that type of a jig head, as you're pulling it, it tends to pull the head of the jig up into the air. It helps to climb over rocks as well. So also these two jig heads are just straight weight. There's nothing in it. This particular jig head has a rattle. You can probably hear it. So this is the actual rattle that's built in. Some anglers will snap on rattles, and sometimes the rattles make a big difference, especially if you're fishing discolored water or very deep water and you're trying to track the fish from a further distance. So using a simple tube with tube jig heads is one of the best ways to catch smallmouth bass. Well, the nice overcast skies have turned to rain showers. Bill, while you fish the front and work the electric, I'm going to land this guy off the back of the boat. Okay. Because the jig head goes inside the tube, you can see that while I've been fighting the fish, the tube has slid right up the line. Now it's sliding back down. I'll tell you, these fish have a lot of energy. Even with the overcast skies, you can see that fish fighting down there. The water is crystal clear here. And they can detect that tiniest of movement with those tubes. Nice fish. He's about 2.5, maybe 3 pounds. Hooked right in the side of the mouth. You can see the jig head that I'm using, that gold part is actually rattles inside to track them. Nice healthy smallmouth. And you know, while the rain started, the wind has also picked up. So every once in a while we're getting almost like a dust storm blowing in across the canals here when it's gusting. But we're going to keep fishing a little bit longer, because a lot of times when you get a wet front moving in, like showers, the fish will actually move shallower. So the fishing can be really good.